What would you think if I told you that silence, real, deep, deliberate silence, isn't weakness, passivity, or withdrawal, but power in its rawest, most ancient form? In a world saturated with noise, where constant messaging, instant responses, and emotional validation are traded like currency, the refusal to speak, to explain, to chase, is rebellion. And rebellion, in the feminine psyche, is unforgettable. To go silent is to become the unknown. And what is unknown always holds power. The masculine archetype in its most refined form does not shout. He does not beg to be understood. He simply withdraws into his stillness. And in that silence, the feminine begins to spiral, because silence echoes into the psyche louder than words ever could. The conscious mind may dismiss it, but the unconscious feels it like a drumbeat in the dark. Carl Jung believed that what is not brought to consciousness comes back as fate. And silence, wielded consciously, returns to the other not as apathy, but as a mirror. A reflection of their own actions, their shadows, their repressed truths. A woman might demand closure, but what she truly fears is the silence that gives her space to confront herself. Your silence becomes the arena for her own reckoning. When a man stops explaining himself, when he detaches with presence instead of panic, when he says nothing instead of saying too much, he taps into the sacred masculine principle of containment. He becomes the vessel that no longer leaks his energy out in the form of over-explanation, emotional neediness, or performative care. You think silence is doing nothing. But in truth, it is doing everything. It creates space, and space is the crucible of transformation. The ancient Stoics knew this. Seneca wrote that most harm comes not from events, but from our response to them. Silence denies the world a reaction. It pulls you back into sovereign ground. And from there, the battlefield is no longer her emotions, it's your restraint. So when you stop calling, stop texting, stop seeking validation, you don't disappear, you become mythic. You enter her unconscious not as a man she lost, but as a symbol she cannot replace. Because silence, when done from strength, not spite, is the most dangerous move you can make. Silence does not beg to be noticed, it demands to be felt. It does not argue. It does not plead. It does not negotiate. It simply is. And in that stillness, a woman who once took your presence for granted begins to feel the pull of her own projections echoing back to her, unanswered. You see, Jung taught that every individual harbors within them an inner blueprint, an anima in men, an animus in women. These unconscious masculine and feminine energies are shaped by early experiences, social conditioning, and repressed longing. When a woman becomes addicted to chaos, to validation, to emotional noise, she isn't just chasing men. She's chasing her inner animus, distorted and disoriented, projected onto every man who leans in too far, gives too easily, bleeds for her approval. But when you go silent, truly silent, not in punishment but in power, you withdraw that projection. You become the void. And the void is sacred. It's the place where the false dies and the real emerges. In your absence, she meets herself, her true self. And it burns. Because silence makes her question why she needed your words in the first place. Why your attention fed her sense of worth. Why she confused being desired with being valuable. This is where the spell breaks, and where real healing can begin. Not because you told her to, but because your lack of words forced her inner voice to rise. It is the divine masculine who chooses silence not out of ego, but from discernment. He knows not every wound requires tending, not every cry deserves an answer. Sometimes the highest form of love is not to reach out, but to stand still and allow the other to meet themselves fully, naked, unbuffered, alone. But understand, your silence only has power if it is rooted in clarity. If it is reactive, resentful, manipulative, it becomes noise of another kind. But if it comes from alignment, from a deep knowing that your energy is sacred and should not be traded for breadcrumbs, then your silence becomes alchemical. It transforms not just the dynamic, but the soul of the one listening for a voice that never arrives. In the quiet, she either rises or fades. But you remain untouched, untethered, unbroken. Silence, when wielded by the man who has done the inner work, becomes a mirror so merciless it shatters illusions. It slices through fantasy like glass, revealing the raw wound of unworthiness that so many try to cover with constant noise. In a world that runs on distraction, presence through silence becomes a revolutionary act. A woman addicted to validation will feel it like a cold withdrawal. Not from you, but from the false self she had created to survive. She had once believed that her beauty should always be enough, that her charm could bend you, that your attention was hers by divine entitlement. But silence unmasks that illusion. Suddenly, she is faced with a truth more terrifying than rejection: indifference. It is not cruelty. It is a spiritual recalibration. When you step back, the animus she projected onto you begins to dissolve. The powerful, all-knowing inner masculine she imagined you to be is now unavailable. She can no longer feed from that energy. The drug is gone. And now, she must either spiral deeper into her shadow, or rise into her selfhood. This is where the archetype of the sovereign woman is born, from silence, from the space between what she wants and what she truly needs. She may rage. She may chase. She may play every game in the book to provoke a response. But if you remain rooted, non-reactive, still, she learns. She sees. She begins to understand that your silence was not abandonment, it was protection. Not for her comfort, but for your soul. A soul that refuses to be reduced to a dopamine dispenser for the emotionally underfed. A soul that sees relationship as sacred, not transactional. Because the man who has mastered himself no longer gives to be chosen. He gives only when it is received with reverence, not expectation. And when it is not, he retracts. Not in anger, not in pride, but in deep reverence for his own energy, which he no longer spills carelessly. Do you feel that? That rising ache? That inner tension when the game no longer works, when the chase falls flat, when silence becomes louder than words? That's not rejection. That's your shadow, staring back at you. Silence, when it lingers, does something no argument, no affection, no apology can ever achieve. It forces confrontation with the self behind the mask, the self beneath the seduction. And when the silence comes from the masculine, especially one who is grounded, sovereign, and uninterested in control, it cracks open the very foundation of what she thought love was supposed to be. The addict in her, the part conditioned by a culture that equates attention with worth, will tremble. She was taught that constant affirmation is intimacy, that emotional availability on command equals love. But a man who withholds not out of spite, but sovereignty, reveals that her entire model was a projection. He does not play the role she assigned. He exits the script. And that alone destroys the illusion. Carl Jung called it the withdrawal of projection, when the object of obsession no longer carries the archetypal weight we placed upon them. And for many women, this withdrawal feels like death. Not the death of the man, but the death of the illusion he carried. The fantasy dissolves. The animus image collapses. And what remains is her, the raw, unshielded, unvalidated self. And this is where the invitation begins. When the external mirror no longer reflects what you want to see, you are left with only your inner world. Your childhood echoes. Your unmet needs. Your untold stories. Your hungry ghosts. Silence doesn't create this reckoning, it reveals it. The man who goes silent is often the one who sees through it all. He watches as she thrashes against the emptiness, calling it abandonment, calling it punishment, but in truth, it is the alchemy of awakening. To the unaware, silence is an insult. To the evolved, it is initiation. You, yes you, have you ever paused to notice the way your nervous system reacts when the noise dies down? The way your mind panics when the notifications stop? The way your heart races not from love, but from the absence of distraction? That is not loss. That is shadow rising to the surface, begging to be seen, begging to be integrated. And the man who chooses silence over chaos, stillness over performance, he is not walking away. He is holding the line. Drawing the sacred boundary that says, "My energy is not a commodity. My presence is earned, not owed." In the economy of modern romance, silence has become an act of war. A rebellion against emotional overexposure, against the dopamine-fueled expectations that every message be answered within minutes, that every thought be shared, that intimacy mean immediacy. But true masculine silence isn't born from cruelty, it is born from power. The kind of power that doesn't need to prove, perform, or possess. The kind of power that knows its own worth, and demands the same from the other. When a man withdraws, not as a game, but as a declaration of inner calm, he sends a psychic shockwave into the space between. Women who are addicted to validation feel it as abandonment. But this is no ordinary abandonment, it is the archetypal exile of the feminine animus. She is not losing him, she is being forced to meet herself. In Jungian language, this moment is the threshold of individuation. The place where projection dies and selfhood begins. He was never the god. He was the mirror. And now the mirror has gone dark, and she must confront the question she has long avoided. Without him, who am I? This is where her real journey begins. The woman who cannot sit with silence will never know the sound of her own soul. The one who panics in the absence of male attention is still a child in a woman's body, seeking father energy in lovers, confusing masculine withdrawal with rejection, when often it is simply a return to sovereignty. Can you feel it now? That rawness in your chest when you don't hear from him? That voice whispering, "You're not enough if he doesn't respond." That's not love. That's trauma. That's a forgotten wound, wide open and aching for anesthetic. And silence, as painful as it feels, is not the injury, it is the medicine. But medicine often tastes bitter before it heals. Men who practice this silence, this sacred refusal to overextend, do not aim to punish. They aim to purify. And a woman with depth will feel it. She won't beg. She won't chase. She'll listen, not to him, but to herself. To the storm that rises inside her. To the child that cries. To the goddess that sleeps. And if she is brave, truly brave, she will let the silence make her sovereign too. ChatGPT said. Silence strips the illusions bare. In its echo, the mask of charm falls, and what remains is raw truth. And truth, unlike fantasy, cannot be manipulated. It stands unmoved. It asks questions few are willing to answer. It reveals the imbalance of emotional labor, the dependency disguised as passion, the weakness masked as vulnerability. In the absence of his words, she hears her own desperation. In the absence of his presence, she confronts the empty parts of herself she once begged him to fill. This is why silence is so dangerous. It holds up the mirror to every unhealed story. The modern woman, conditioned by endless access and digital comfort, is terrified by space. She believes connection must be constant to be real. But real connection is not measured by closeness. It is tested in distance. If your bond disintegrates the moment silence enters, it was never a bond. It was a bargain. And bargains are not love. They are transactions born of scarcity. If I give him this, maybe he'll stay. If I become that, maybe I'll be enough. But silence doesn't entertain these scripts. It doesn't flatter your ego. It doesn't care if you're afraid. It simply waits, stoic, unmoved, like the mountain in the storm, asking, "Will you rise or will you collapse?" This is where the masculine holds its ground. Not in aggression, but in calm detachment. Not to dominate, but to disrupt the addiction. He who can sit in silence does not need to chase, to explain, to convince. His energy is rare because it is whole. And wholeness never begs to be received. It becomes the gravitational force that draws the fragmented into reflection. To the woman on the receiving end, this silence can feel like abandonment. But those who know themselves will recognize it as an invitation. A moment to look inward, to ask, why do I need so much from someone else? Why does stillness feel like suffocation? And beneath those questions, a deeper truth emerges. She is not powerless. She has simply never been alone with herself long enough to realize her own gravity. He was never the drug. He was the withdrawal. And in that ache, if she chooses, she will awaken. This is where the polarity reverses. Where once she was the seeker and he the source, now she is the storm behind the stillness. She has entered the archetype of the high priestess, cloaked in depth, sovereign in solitude, unconcerned with being understood, and uninterested in performing softness for the sake of male comfort. Her silence becomes sacred. It is not passive. It is not a tactic. It is a transmission. She has stopped trying to convince, to explain, to decode. She lets the silence speak for her, and what it speaks is power, pure, refined, and unyielding. This is what Jung meant by the individuation process. The reclaiming of all lost selves. No longer does she outsource her validation. No longer does she beg crumbs of attention and call it a feast. She chooses wholeness over hunger, depth over drama, alignment over attachment. And yet, for the man on the receiving end of this silence, the terrain is unfamiliar. He was conditioned to associate feminine presence with immediate response, emotional caretaking, constant emotional access. Now, stripped of her attention, he confronts his own shadow, the fragile boy hidden beneath the alpha mask. The boy who equated dominance with safety, praise with love, and her availability with his worth. Without her energy to feed off, he feels hollow. The mirror is gone. The applause is silent. And in that void, he must finally ask, who am I without her chasing me? If he is wise, he too begins the inner journey. He may step into the masculine archetype that no longer needs to dominate to feel alive, that no longer fears the feminine fire but honors it. That sees her, not as conquest, but as companion in awakening. But whether he awakens or not, it no longer defines her path. Her silence has severed the psychic cord. She is no longer addicted to the drama. She no longer romanticizes her own suffering. She has seen herself clearly, and once a woman truly sees herself, she becomes untouchable. She does not raise her voice. She raises her value. Her silence says, if you want access to my heart, come correct, or don't come at all. And the world shifts around a woman like that.